Hi, I'm Sharat Kutan and welcome to Consider This. Today we'll be looking at the Youth Aspiration Manifesto survey. It's come out looking at the aspirations, thoughts, and feelings of younger Malaysians as they look to the future. Now, to discuss this, we have Jason Wee. He's the co founder of Architects for Diversity, the NGO that actually ran the survey. Jason, thank you so much for joining us. Let's begin with who Architects for Diversity. I think you're one of the new kids on the NGO block. So tell us, what do you do exactly?
Thanks, Sharad. Yeah, my name is Jason, and Architects Diversity is a nonprofit that bridges communities and identity groups among youth in Malaysia. Primarily, we work on diversity inclusion education and also work towards research that helps bridge the divides between Malaysians. And so this primarily focuses on race and religion, but as well as more broadly, we're concerned with youth. What are youth thinking and what are dividing youth in Malaysia today?
Right. So how come Undi 18, which I believe commissioned the survey, went to your group rather than a traditional polling organization like Merdeka Center or the others that existed?
Right. So the Youth Aspiration Manifesto survey was part of a larger campaign. It's part of our Only 100 Seratus Peratus campaign, which inspires to get 100% of youth to vote in upcoming general elections. Now, no, we're not a pollster. So we work together with a survey company to run the survey. But the questions and the thought going behind the actual development of the survey comes from both Architects of Diversity as well as Undi 18, really trying to get a sense of the pulse of what's going on in youth today.
Yeah, so that's very interesting because there are many polls, and I can imagine that target youth in terms of what they might aspire towards, or and the kinds of questions that you ask will, in many ways, kind of determine the kind of broad profile that you're creating. So, in how different is, say, your approach and the approach of Undi 18 to this survey? What would have been different from, say, perhaps a traditional pollster when they kind of measured the sentiment among young people?
For sure. I think what we see in many polls is we get a general sense of sentiments, right? So we fear, they oftentimes ask, what are you fearing and what are your priorities? But something we do in our surveys ask specifically about policy issues. And that's something that hasn't really surfaced so much. And so what do we mean by policy issues especially when we're coming up with the questions, is looking at what exactly is on the block, what's exactly in the roster to be somewhat either debated in parliament, some perhaps a policy that's being discussed in mainstream discourse, or an idea that's being floated around in policy circles. So, for example, one of the classic kind of policy issues has been a minimum wage, and we ran the survey prior to the increase of the minimum wage a few months ago, and that was something that we really cared about. But what are the other sort of policy issues that we oftentimes don't have a sense of sense of pulse on how the youth are feeling at the moment? And that's really what the motivation factor was behind the survey.
Right. I understand that many of us think that Malaysian democracy would be better served if the public was focused on policy issues rather than as has been for decades on party loyalties or perhaps ethnic sentiment. I think is the other thing that we
Mhm.
often kind of rail against. Charisma is something that many sober, liberal, progressive minds also feel uncomfortable with. But was there anything in the survey that looked at that? Because charisma, ethnic sentiment, these things are quite, I think, remain strong. Don't you think? In even as a young population like the one that you surveyed.
Of course, you're right. I mean, it's youth are not a homogenous group, right? Youth are largely diversified, and as the survey results showed, continues to diversify even compared to the elders. What I think, what the survey's purpose isn't about measuring voting behavior per se, because most definitely you're exactly right that co-ethnic voting, charisma, all of these things are affecting how youth are voting, and what we see in Johor, where a large sentiment was also still using the same kind of campaigning tactics what we've seen in the past. I think what we're trying to point to is that there's a lack of information out there about what youth care. Given that youth have primarily, one, been not included in the system, given that only 18 is just reintroduced in December, and we've seen millions of new voters enter the voting voter roll, but also how can politicians attract these youth better, given that competition is getting increasingly more difficult, right? Compared if you say take BN and PN, where oftentimes people are confused between the two. How can these parties distinguish between each other? Is simply by policy mechanisms. So obviously this is an ideal state of being, but we need to ask, how do we get there? And by getting there, we need this necessary piece of information that political parties can use and hopefully will use in the time to come when forming items like their manifestos or their promises, or even just how are they going to address the constituencies, rather than just banking on loyalty and rhetoric.
Okay, so before we get to how others might use this particular survey, and one wonders if they're going to try and reverse engineer, as it were, change themselves to suit the ground. But before we get to that, I want to ask you how the survey itself, because I know 2 of the 3 parts of the survey have been made public now. How is it being framed by the media? What is it that the media picked up, and was it different from what you and your group wanted to project?
So the survey was done among 3,089 respondents, and how the media has kind of framed it. I think one has been quite agreeable on the first level with what we want to emphasize. The first time we released it, a lot of the conversation was around this number where 59% of youth fear that they can never buy a home in their lifetime, and that was perhaps definitely one of the more shocking things, given that people have been discussing a fear of home ownership, and property markets have been in flux the past few years, but this finally put a number to kind of the feeling on the ground. And so that was very much concurrent. The second thing was a bit unexpected, was about the racial lines. So a news report came out and mentioned that, kind of highlighted our survey showed that Malaysian youth were still split according to racial lines when it came to issues of affirmative action. So whether or not Bumi Putras or Malays should be accorded special privileges in things like scholarships, in things like public contracts, in things like public employment. All these issues were still very much split on racial lines, and the media chose to highlight that. I think it demonstrates that we are quite used to this pattern of understanding the voting demographic according to racial lines, and to some extent, it's definitely true as well, because youth are very much not so much different to some extent compared to the other counterparts. But at the same time, we also have seen new divisions that haven't been highlighted by the media. More specifically, ones that relate to law and order, especially, for example, the case of the recent execution of Agintren, where the death penalty has been a huge conversation, at least among issues of, if you follow social media. But how does that reflect actually among the youth populations? We've seen that there's huge splits, right, where almost youth are completely split 3 ways on the issue of death penalty. Almost a third support it, almost a third are neutral about it, and a third are completely opposed to it. So what does that really say about how we want to talk about the youth generation? Because it's not so much that we're pegging them to the same kind of issues that have been in the media and in cycle, but also what are new divisions that perhaps the politicians should care about are exactly issues like punishment and how we would counteract how do we address different forms of ills in society.
Yeah, I want to ask you about that because often polls are snapshots in time, and they don't tell us about the dynamics necessarily. So if say you split 3 ways on a particular issue, which of those segments are on the rise, which are in decline, and which are static, right? So because sentiments might grow. I mean, the anti-death penalty sentiment might grow. But what's driving that? Is it? And I want to know if your survey in many ways addresses the influences. I mean, are young people largely influenced by their parents, by their peers, by political parties? Who's shaping the minds of young people?
I mean, the survey doesn't ask that, but I can quickly answer what are youth prioritizing in terms of the dynamics, right? Because what we've seen according from old surveys, especially ones that have been released by Merdeka Center in recent times as well, and also has been echoed again by our survey, has showed a consistent trend of simple that economic priorities are always top concern for youth. That is simply unchanging, right? But I think our survey demonstrated that there are a couple of things that were not only agreeable, but also ranked the highest in terms of priorities compared to other policies for the youth that we surveyed. One is clearly, affordable homes. That means they support somewhat of a level of government intervention in correcting the markets per se, right? Number two is obviously minimum wage. We also see a strong support for government intervention in terms of increasing the minimum wage and counteracting some sort of free market hand in that sense. And also the third one is also to do with public health care. And so all these three characteristics are, sometimes consistent with what we've talked about. That youth have primary concerns. They're just graduating. They're coming to their first, maybe second job, and these are the main concerns. Now, exactly what's shaping that? And it's most likely to do with the changing circumstances of our socioeconomic realities, right? A lot of these things perhaps might not be a concern for older generations because oftentimes older generations hold the capital and have more secure financial positions. But I think, for matter of fact, what it's influencing this, it's simply real life conditions that are putting these top priorities at the top when it's going to be difficult to think about your bread and butter. So I know the conversation around this bread and butter issue is kind of, it's overdone. All the politicians and the political parties know that, yes, we need to emphasize the bread and butter issues. But we also see that there's also that highly diversified youth sector that also care about, albeit to a lesser priority, about drug policy, about punishing speech, about the death penalty. And these are issues, although they're not as high priority, they could be used as a form of capture when all politicians are clamoring around economic issues as well.
Right. And of course, behind each of these, options that people take, they say they're concerned most about homes. The choice of solution, I guess, is also a window on their ideological worldview. Who do they want to solve these problems? Do they want to be community-based? Do they want the state to intervene? Or like you said, it's a question of the market. Now, we're unfortunately running out of time. Could you quickly tell us where people can go to find the more granular, stuff on the survey, and so they can also read what actually is in.
Right. People can go to undi100.org. So that's UINDI100.org to read more about the survey, as well as to submit your own aspirations. I think oftentimes with survey data, we're getting a broad overview about what the generalizability about the support. But what's also important is the specific concerns of youth. And what we've seen is also a great support for more government engagement on the ground with youth that we perhaps haven't seen before. And so we're supplementing that. Go to undi100.org to submit your youth aspiration as well.
Right. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Rod.
Jason Wee, he's co-founder of Architects for Diversity. Speaking about the Youth Aspiration Manifesto survey, we'll be back with more. Stay tuned to consider this. Hi, and welcome back to Consider This. I'm Sharad Kuttan. We're talking about a new survey called Youth Aspiration Manifesto Survey. It's conducted by the Architect of Diversity. It's just spoken to Jason Wee there. Now we have Tharma Pillai from Undi 18, one of the co-founders, and was a fairly regular guest on Consider This. Tharma, thank you so much for speaking to us. I know you're speaking from Pankor, where perhaps Wi-Fi is not the best. I don't know if that's part of the youth aspirations of better connectivity. Let me just talk to you about, why Undi 18 commissioned this survey. Well, what is really the thinking? Because we know there have been many surveys out there about this new demographic now coming, now franchise and now being able to vote. What was the thinking about doing one, with Architects for Diversity?
Right. Firstly, thank you very much for having me as usual. And I'm so sorry. Really, I wish I could just turn on my camera and just and speak, and at least you can see my face a little bit. But it's okay. Maybe next time, right? But I think the idea behind the survey, as you rightly mentioned, right, is that we really want to understand this demographic, because you're looking at 5.8 million new voters. You're looking at 58% of the new electorate, right? So when we come to GE15, these are the majority of voters. Of course, we don't know yet whether they're going to turn out or not. I think there's a lot of factors involved, but fundamentally, if we want to understand democracy, we want to understand what voters are, are concerned of. You have to understand the largest group of people, and at the moment, this is a young group of people where a lot of people are thinking and questioning what do they want exactly. And I think the difference that I want to try to emphasize with this particular survey is that we ask very pointed, specific policy questions, right? Because, and we really want to understand a few things. One is, what is areas of big differences, and where are areas of convergence where we agree on each other, right? But also very important, and I think this part I really want to emphasize, that what are parts that we don't know, and that the vast majority of the youth, maybe they don't have a they don't have a big portion where they're neutral on, right? So I give you one example. In a previous survey that we did, the segment on vernacular schools, like that was something that I had intuitively thought that it was going to be a completely split 50-50, it's clear cut. But the reality was that there is a massive 30% of the group where they're undecided, they're neutral, similar to issues of death penalty. And I think these are issues that we often intuitively think, oh, this is a 50-50 issue, people are completely divided. But the reality is very different. There's a huge neutral middle ground. And I think this is an important element where, if you are an NGO or a CSO, if you're an advocate, you're a government policymaker, these are things that you can pick up and be like, how do I do communications better? If I was an anti-death penalty advocate, it's a very, very good sign that 30% of the population are neutral about it, because this means that this population can be brought over to your side, whether it's pro-death penalty or anti-death penalty. I think this element is very, very important, and we really want to bring in the policy-centric discourse to what is often a sentiment-centric discourse in our country.
Okay, so Tharma, I'm very interested in the focus in policy, because I think, as I was saying to Jason, I think we want voters to be thinking about policies that shape their lives, but often people don't have the time, the bandwidth, as it were, to focus on policies that complex issues. They require discussions of trade-offs, not necessarily what's good and what's bad. So, can a survey like this capture the nuances? I mean, do your respondents actually understand enough in order to kind of tick the right box? And is that what's happening with the I don't know category? It's large because people just haven't had the time to think about these issues.
Right. I think the idea is that we are not advocating for very specific policy outcomes, right? So, for example, in the issue of vernacular schools, we're not saying that should we only have a single, a single education, or should we abolish FRSM, or should we, abolish Tamil schools, for example. We're not asking for very particular, specific policy choices. We're asking a general policy direction for certain issues. So, for example, on e-hailing, should there be better policies? On death penalty, should the death penalty continue or not? Right? I think these are the ideas. So, which means that if we can identify, I mean, it's not very broad, but it's perhaps we try to close, or we try to narrow down the dimensions of policy agreement or disagreement, right? So in that case, it gives you a signal, especially for policymakers and governments, and also politicians when they're making their manifestos, right? What are segments where people agree or disagree, or disagree on, and how can I then identify specific solutions in this specific or in this smaller area of policy direction? I think that's the key concern.
So this is interesting, because a survey like this could lead some political parties to decide, well, we'll just go with the majority, right? If the dominant group, leans this way, then we'll go with that. But what surveys often don't tell us is, yes, a particular sentiment might be dominant, but there might be an emergent sentiment, something that's actually going to potentially overtake the current dominant position, because what's behind it is either changes in thinking that are coming through social media that's driving youth, and pointing them in a different direction. Do we have a sense, and this beyond the survey, Dharma, do you have a sense of how dynamic sentiments are within the youth demographic?
I think firstly, I think one touch on, I think the point that you brought up, just a little bit at the start. I think it is important for that comparison to be done, and that's one of the things we want to achieve through this, right? Because when we want to try to understand the youth, it's not just about understanding, what do youth feel like and what do they support, but also as a comparison, as a relative, as a relative policy choice compared to older generations, previous generations, right? I think that trend is something that's very important, and that's something that we hope to be able to identify and also be able to understand, right? But the second part is also to understand the variety of what young people want, and I do think that it's also very important because often there are very huge generalization about young people are conservative, young people are liberal, young people don't care. But clearly, when you look at the survey results, it's actually very different, right? I think that's one element, but also being able to identify and break through stereotypes, right? I think we often say that Malay youth feel a certain way, Indian or Chinese youth feel a certain way, urbanites feel a certain way. But I think when we have this sort of data, you are able to appreciate the dynamism, the variety, and the uniqueness of different segments of young people, and therefore be able to create better policies and also push certain narratives in a more, I think, more supported manner. I think that's really what we want to try to do, right? And also I think
I
another,
wonder what the
yeah,
danger, though, I mean, with surveys like this, is that because of the populist impulse among most political parties in Malaysia, they are going to go for the what is the biggest group and where we're going to get the most votes by, reflecting the interests of the majority. Isn't that one of the downsides, in some sense, of polling as a tool for shaping a political manifesto?
for sure. But I think the interesting thing is that when you look at where do people agree upon, it's really things where you wish politicians would actually make something happen, right? For example, the issues of minimum wage, issues of housing disparity, high cost of living, right? These are fundamentally issues that 80-90% of the people who were surveyed agreed upon it, right? So honestly, if let's say politicians were to wake up and be like, you know what, these are things that we want to have to work on, I would be very happy, right? But I do think that also what's very interesting is that it also, I think, it provides you the counter narrative, right? Because a lot of times populist politicians always make certain claims that refugees are bad, death penalty is something people want. People are strongly against vernacular school, but a lot of these strongly populist narratives are broken down, and you can actually challenge it based on data. And so I think there is a pros and pro. And I think I totally agree with you. There is two sides of this, right? But fundamentally, when you look at the data that we produce and the reports we are providing on economic fronts, I think we are happy to be as populist as possible. But on social fronts, there is a lot of variety, and that's where you can challenge populist narratives on ethnicity, on religion, on xenophobia, because there's a lot of counter narrative to what the populists are already saying right now.
So where do you go from this survey? I know if surveys are, a starting point for a conversation, and it's very interesting how the media has framed some of the results from your survey. Where do you take this, and in what kinds of activities or engagements are going to be done so that this gets deep in this conversation with younger people about policy, in fact, goes deeper?
For sure. I think the first and foremost, I think we do have to plan the immediate thing, which is the G15, right? I do think that there is an opportunity to impact and affect how the political parties build their manifestos, and also how do they make certain policies, especially on a state level, not just on a federal level. I think that's one element. I think that's very important that we want to go forward with. Number two, I also want to emphasize that when we are able to do this, and we are able to work with different pressure groups, for example, ATPAN for death penalty, and refugee groups, and drug, groups that are in favor of medical marijuana. I think this also helps us to be able to tell the public that, hey, you might be seeing this narrative on social media a lot, but in reality, this is the counter narrative that you have. I do think that from a communications perspective, because I think, as you know, Undi 18 fundamentally is an advocacy group. So for us, we want to push for policy changes. So it always is very helpful when you're able to have a counter narrative, so that if you are agreeing with me or if you're disagreeing with me, you know that how many percent of the public agrees or disagree with you. Honestly, there's many ways for you to play with it as an advocacy group. But I think the fact that you have the data is very powerful in and of itself.
All right, very quickly as we kind of wrap this up, how important are the youth wings of political parties in shaping the youth agenda? And are you engaged with them specifically to help shape those platforms that are going to be part of the landscape in the coming general election?
Absolutely. I think it's so important to empower youth groups with ideas and idealism, because often I think one of the issues with a lot of current youth wings is that they have been working within established structures. And if and this is our role as civil society, right, where we come in and we push and we nudge and we prod so that these youth wings have the ideas and the language to advocate for certain things with their older colleagues and within their parties. So in our previous press conference launch, we invited youth party members from across the spectrum, and we're very, very happy that we got all major coalitions to attend our launch. I think that's something that's so important, and we will continue the work with them, because these are going to be our investment in the future, right? You want to invest in our political future, you got to invest in the youth wings.
Right. Thank you so much. That was Dharma Pillai, co-founder of Undi 18. We've been talking about the Youth Aspiration Manifesto Survey conducted by Architects of Diversity, commissioned by Undi 18. That's all we have for Consider This this week. I'm Sharad Bitton, signing off for Astro.